Well, hello, everybody. My name is Dave, and I just want to say thank you for taking the time to join us online today. Whether you're watching us or listening to us, we're just grateful that you're part of the Great Lakes Church community. So here's the deal. We are filming this talk in the early part of July. And you know this, that the early part of July tends to be a fun time for our country because we have July 4th, which is a celebration of the Declaration of Independence. And we celebrate with fun and with food and with fireworks and all types of different activities. Well, this year, what we did is we celebrated our birthday, and our birthday is that we are now 245 years old. All right? We're pretty old as a country. And so what I want to do today, just for fun, is give you some trivia, give you some facts that I personally did not know until I came across them. And they're facts about our country, and they're facts about our economy. Like, for instance, did you know this? Because I didn't, that it cost almost 2 cents to make a penny, and it cost just over 7 cents to make a nickel. If you wonder why we have the financial issues that we do, that is one of the reasons why. Another interesting fact about our country is that 2/3 of $100 bills, 2/3 of the U.S. $100 bills are held by people outside of the United States. That probably doesn't shock too many of us. Another interesting fact is that when Thomas Jefferson was the president of the United States, he would actually greet people at the White House by wearing his robe and slippers. Right? He was the first Hugh Hefner. This guy just was comfortable in his own skin. President James Madison, he was 5 foot 4 inches tall, and he weighed less than 100 pounds. So less than an average teenage girl. That was the president. Grover Cleveland, when he was president, this is fascinating, he actually answered the White House phone himself. So you call, and he answers the phone, and if that happened today, of course, we'd say, is the refrigerator running? Oh, go chase after it, right? Something stupid. Here's a fact. There is an estimated 10% of us who actually have a relative, so we're blood related to one of the original pilgrims on the Mayflower that came over in 1620. That's pretty impressive. Another interesting fact that I learned recently is that during the Prohibition, the government wanted to really keep people away from alcohol, and so they put toxic chemicals inside of the alcohol, and they did it to get people to stop drinking. Well, those chemicals were poison of sorts, and so I don't think it was intentional, but they ended up killing thousands of people. One more fascinating fact, and it has a lot to do with the United States, and that is 1 out of 8 of us, pretty high percentage, has worked at McDonald's at one point or another. That says a whole lot about us. But I bring these things up because let's just say it like it, let's just say the facts. We live in a fascinating country. It's an interesting country, but it has a lot of flaws, just like many cities and many countries throughout history, right? It's always been that way. And what I want to do today is I want to talk about how do you follow Jesus in America today? How to follow Jesus. How to be a citizen of heaven more than a citizen of the United States. And the reason I want to talk about this is personally, I have found that it is becoming increasingly difficult for me to be open about my faith. Right? I realize there are things about my faith that are in conflict with where most of culture is at. Not everything. And then, of course, if I speak up about something, I live in danger, just like you do, of being canceled and being called intolerant and judgmental. So how to follow Jesus in America today? Now, 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul, he writes a letter to a young pastor living in the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was a lot like the city of Chicago. It was a port city. It was a city where the people had lots of influence. They were sophisticated and cultured. Most of the people there were better off financially than those living in other communities. And so Ephesus was a very diverse city, especially when it came to ethnicity and religion. Very much like Chicago. Now, there was one exception that I could tell you about, and that is recently archaeologists discovered documents that indicate Ephesus had a winning football team. Okay, so there's a little separation there. But here's the deal. The Apostle Paul, he writes this letter to a young pastor named Timothy, and instead of bashing the city of Ephesus and talking about all the evils, he actually writes to them, and he says this. He says, I urge you, first of all, to pray for all people. Ask God to help them, intercede on their behalf, and give thanks for them. He says, pray for people. Because when we pray for people, it changes our perspective. It softens our hearts towards them. It impacts how we interact with them. So he says, pray for all people. And then he goes on, he says, pray this way for kings and all who are in authority, so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives marked by godliness and dignity. Now, for the past year and a half, our country has been more polarized and divided than I've ever seen it in my lifetime. But it's nothing new. David Brooks, who is a conservative commentator, he writes about how every 60 years or so, there is a cultural convulsion in our country. And he talks about how the last big one was in 1968, where there was the Vietnam War protests and the Civil War protests, and all of those things escalated into violence. In fact, Mayor Daley in Chicago, he basically said to the police, he said, just break everyone's head open. And they did, and it was just out of control. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed and at that time. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. A lesser known fact is that during this time period, there was also a pandemic, and the name at the time was not controversial. It was called the Hong Kong flu, and upwards of 4 million people around the world died. Now, just put that aside. Somehow Woodstock happened in the midst of all of that. So I don't know how you could allow that in the midst of a pandemic. But here you had a pandemic going on. There was cultural division. America was coming apart. There was lots of distrust towards leadership. Churches were splitting apart because of different disagreements. And so the impacts of what they went through lasted certainly well into the 1970s. And now we're seeing that again. The repercussions of what we've experienced over the last 12 to 18 months, it's going to carry with us for a long time. And so what I want to do today is I want to echo the words of the Apostle Paul, who said that we should pray for everybody. Specifically, we should pray for those in authority. Why? So that we can live peaceful and quiet lives that are marked by godliness and dignity. That our lives are better off. Now, here's the deal. We could talk about the flaws in America, right? You've got a long list of things that you would change about this country. I certainly have a long list of things that I would change. That being said, because we have things that we would change, the topic of America tends to be an emotional topic. And if you step back and consider why, it's because we all see this country through different filters. You know, Jesus himself, he talked about this as it relates to life. He said, your eye is like a lamp that provides light for your body. He says, when your eye is healthy, your whole body is filled with light. But when it's unhealthy, your body is filled with darkness. In other words, we all see through certain filters. And when we talk about our country, if we're honest with ourselves, we see it through different filters. We see it through the CNN filter, or the Fox News filter, or the MSNBC filter. We see it through the Republican filter, Libertarian filter, Democrat filter. On top of that, we have the filter of our personality. We have the filter of our emotions. We have the filter of our upbringing. It is absolutely impossible for us to talk about our country without some sort of filter. And that's the reason our country is so polarized right now. It's why we see so much division. We just have different perspectives and different views and different filters. And that's totally normal. But regardless of how negative our filter may be, the fact is we're able to think the way we think because we're not living in North Korea, right? We're not living in a place where there's only 4 TV stations and they're all owned by the government. So it's actually a blessing that we see things differently and that we have different perspectives. And so here's what I'm going to ask you to do today. I'm going to ask you as best as you possibly can. I know it's not going to be 100% possible, but as best as you can, just put aside your filters for a little bit and just kind of join me here as we have this conversation about how to live in our country and what it looks to live in our country as a follower of Jesus. Now, the starting place for this talk is a little word called freedom. Right now, there are roughly 50 countries in our world run by dictators. And there's limited freedom in most of those countries. And so regardless of the things that we would change about the United States and the things we don't like, here's the deal. None of us want to move to South Sudan. We don't want to move to Afghanistan. Certainly none of us want to move to Canada. Right? We have lots and lots of freedoms, and we love those freedoms. We love the freedom of speech. That means I could talk about your mama, and you could curse me out, and we could go back and forth on social media, and then we can block each other. That's the freedom we have. We have the freedom to assemble and get together and create groups and different societies. We can become a Freemason. We can join the Flat Earth Society if we want. That's our right. We have the freedom of religion. That means the government cannot force us to embrace a particular religion or interfere with our worship. We have the right to own firearms, come on. We can use them for self-defense. That is a toxic topic, right? But we have all types of different freedoms. And here's the deal, if we're not careful, we can actually end up worshiping and idolizing our freedom and just talk about all of our rights that we have. It can become so front and center in our life that everything else diminishes. The problem is that if we talk about freedom without talking about embracing responsibility, what happens is things go horribly wrong. Freedom without responsibility leads to recklessness. Life has taught us this, right? Individual rights must be coupled with individual responsibility. So every year, what our government does is spend endless amounts of time creating laws and regulations. And the reason they have to spend so much time doing it, in fact, we have so many laws that quite honestly, we don't even know how many laws exist, but it's because they realize that human nature is it doesn't matter what the law is, someone's going to find a loophole. So someone's going to find a way around it. It's just part of being human. We think creatively, and it starts when we're kids. In fact, recently I saw some posts about test answers from children who answered questions on the test in a way that just reveals the creativity of humans. All right, so let me show you this one. I love this. It says, name the quadrilateral. And the answer the guy gave, Bob, Sam, Tedison, Kate, Harry. That's thinking creatively. Or how about this next one? It shows the cause. Tony practices the piano for 20 minutes each day. What's the effect? Then the kid puts in the answer. He is a big nerd. I love it, but I played piano for 20 years or 18 years of my life, so I'm not mocking the piano players. Here we go. Draw a picture of what you will look like in 100 years. This kid's brilliant. He draws a tombstone. That is exactly what you will look like in 100 years. And then how about this question? What ended in 1896? The kid answered 1895. He is not wrong. He is not wrong. That's a brilliant kid. Here's one more. You're a Chinese immigrant and you are writing a letter home about your experiences. What are some of the things you would say? And this kid is genius. He draws out the Chinese characters and he writes in a way that nobody can really understand. So here's the deal. As adults, we have that kind of creativity, but we use it to find loopholes sometime and find ways to benefit us in ways that come to laws and legalities and all that kind of stuff. And what we found in life, whether it's with a law of a homeowner association or a rule that they have or a rule that some business has or a rule that the United States has, what we found is that there are loopholes to be found and they help us maintain the letter of the law, but of course we ignore the spirit behind it. Now I'll just clarify this one issue, and that is laws are a good thing. But laws really answer the question, how low can I go? Right? How fast can I drive and not get pulled over? Or how fast can I drive, get pulled over, but not get a ticket? Because here's the thing about the law. It does not inspire greatness. It just answers the question, how low can I go? So traffic laws, they're necessary. And I've seen you drive, right? But here's the reality. They don't make us courteous drivers. Tax laws are important. We need to pay for things, but they don't make us generous or financially responsible. Homeowner association rules, they don't make us a good homeowner. They don't make us great neighbors. We have the freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean we're going to be kind and thoughtful in our speech. So here's the deal. Laws are powerless to inspire. And that's okay. That is not the job of the law. But what it means is we can have thousands and thousands and thousands of laws, but still be as selfish as we want to be. We can still protest the soldier's funeral, right? We can heckle the president's speech. It is our right. And without us taking on personal responsibility, our rights will become nothing more than an opportunity to power up. Now, this is nothing new. We've seen it all throughout history, and it's why every civilization has to have a set of rules and laws. In fact, when we look at ancient Jewish civilization, 4,000 years ago, they were led by hundreds of laws. There was like 600 some laws that were a guiding light in Jewish society. And some of them, when you come across them, they're a little bit confusing. They don't make a lot of sense because we don't know the background behind them. But there are others that make a whole lot of sense. In fact, just out of Leviticus chapter 19, we come across laws like be generous to the poor and to the immigrant. Do not steal from anyone. Do not be deceptive in dealings with people. Do not use the name of God to manipulate people. So don't say, well, God told me to tell you, and God says this. No, we don't do that. Do not oppress, rob, or exploit the poor by paying unfair wages. Do not mock those who are disabled. See, these are laws that make sense. Do not be partial to the poor or show favor to those who are wealthy, but judge honestly. Do not slander others. Do not hate other people. And so we have all of these different laws that we look back on and people were being led by them. Do not seek revenge or hold a grudge. Now, you've got all of these laws written out in Leviticus chapter 19, and then what happens is we get to verse 18, and the heart behind these laws is revealed. We read this: do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. So the heart behind these things is, hey, this is to love people and care about people. So to love my neighbor means, in essence, that I'm going to leverage my freedom, the freedom of speech, let's just take, right, in a way that blesses and honors and shows compassion to other people. Now, I'm American. I have the freedom to say what I want and do what I want and live with whoever I want and wherever I want and hang out with whoever I want, right? That being said, I'm also a follower of Jesus, and that means I have a responsibility. Followers of Jesus have the responsibility to leverage their freedom for the sake of other people. And so I have to ask, how am I going to leverage my freedom to treat the people I work with the way I wish I would have been treated at my former company? How am I going to leverage my freedom to treat my boss the way I want to be treated as a boss? If every single one of us would use the freedoms we have in that kind of way, let's just be honest about it. There's no need for laws. There's no need for regulations. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul, he writes a letter to followers of Jesus, and in this letter, he challenges them with these words. He says, "For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love." He says, "For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." Now, when we do that, all the detail, all the fine print, it just becomes irrelevant because we're not looking for a loophole. We're looking for ways to try to use our freedom to serve others. And I know it sounds idealistic and it sounds ridiculous because, come on, who really does that? But this is following Jesus 101. This is just basic to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. In fact, here's how Jesus himself summarized all of the Jewish laws. He says, "Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you." This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets. So how am I going to leverage my freedom to do to others as I would have them do unto me? It's called the golden rule. Now, we can choose not to do this, but if we choose not to do this, what's going to happen is we're going to fuel the self-centeredness in our world. You know, there's a fascinating story in 1 Kings chapter 21. It's about a king of Israel. His name was Ahab. And Ahab wanted to purchase a vineyard next to his palace. Right? He wanted to make some wine. And so he approaches the owner, Naboth, and the owner refuses to sell it. And the reason he refused to sell it is this was property that had been in his family for many years, and he wanted to hand it down and pass it down to his kids and his grandkids. Well, Ahab is visibly upset about it. And his wife Jezebel approaches him and says, "Why are you so upset?" And he explains, "Naboth wouldn't sell me this vineyard, and I want to buy it. I want to make my own wine." And on top of that, you know, he was a Hawks fan, and he was really upset that the Bucks had destroyed his hopes for a championship trophy. And so it was just a really, really difficult season for him. And here's how Jezebel responds. She says, "Are you the king of Israel or not? Get up and eat something, and don't worry about it. I'll get you Naboth's vineyard." See, Jezebel knows she has power and she has influence. And so what she does is comes up with this elaborate plan. We're going to throw a party for Naboth. We're going to celebrate him. And then at the party, I'm going to plant a few different individuals, and they're going to stand up and make accusations against him. They're going to talk about how he cursed God and how he curses the king on a regular basis. And I mean, this is the real life house of cards here. And so sure enough, at this party, these false accusations come against him. And in this time period of history, it is a death penalty. And Naboth, sure enough, ended up being killed, and King Ahab purchased the property. Here's a king with more money than he knows what to do with, right? He builds palaces and cities. He has all kinds of power and all kinds of freedom. But Ahab and Jezebel, they leverage their power and freedom for themselves, and it doesn't end well. Ahab is killed in a battle against another nation. Jezebel, she's thrown off a tall tower and her body was eaten by animals, right? Dateline ends up showing up with their cameras. It was just a horrible, horrible situation. But we read stories like that. And even in our modern day versions, we see people abusing their power and authority, and it drives us crazy because it's like, who would ever do that? Well, it's easy to see in others. It's not easy to see in my own heart. As an American, I got to tell you, it's very easy for me to leverage the freedoms I have for myself. I was here first, so it's my right. Or I was even here second, but I'm more powerful. Or I know the spirit of the law, but since you didn't say it exactly like that and you didn't spell it out, I'm going to find the meanest attorney I can find, and I'm going to destroy you. And if we're all going to live our lives and be obsessed with our individual rights, every man for himself, every woman for herself, and we're going to be every community for themselves, here's the deal. We're going to destroy one another. So let me just close here by giving you just a couple ways that you can use the freedom you have and leverage it in a way that is a blessing to others. If you want to follow the Jesus way. Number one is just do what's helpful. Live with the attitude, with whether it's your parents or your spouse, your coworkers, like, hey, I see you're stressed. I see you've got a lot of things going on, and I've got a little bit of time. I've got a little bit of energy. It's not my job. I know that. It's not my responsibility, but I'd like to help you. Imagine the culture that would create in the different environments. You know, the Apostle Paul, he actually alludes to this in one of his letters. He writes that we need to share each other's burdens, and in this way, he says, you obey the law of Christ. He said, now, if you think you're too important to help someone, you're only fooling yourself. You are not that important. So, here's the deal. If you want to leverage your freedom, you need to do what's helpful. Another thing you need to do is choose to do what's responsible. If you're like everyone else, including me, right, you just point fingers at people and excuse your actions by saying they made me or they caused me to do this or think that way, right? But imagine the difference it'd make if we just say, hey, I'm going to take responsibility. Every couple of months, someone will come up to me at Great Lakes Church and they say, hey, I think Great Lakes should do this and I think we should do that. And so over the years, you know, we should start a soup kitchen, or we should get involved in building and helping these people. And I remember someone talking to me about, man, we should do a lot more for single parents. And I always respond the same way. I'm just warning you. I look at the person and say, what are you personally doing right now about that issue? And if they're doing something, I said, well, you're part of the church. And guess what? The church is doing something. And if they're, if they're not a part of the church, or they're new to the church, and or they're, not doing anything about it, I say, hey, start something about it, and then we'll be doing something. But it's easy to blame, right? It's easy to point fingers, and I'm not growing spiritually, or, this is happening, so I'm going to tell you it's your fault. And we have our excuses. Well, I didn't have a good upbringing. My dad didn't hug me enough. I'm genetically predispositioned this way, right? I took the Myers-Briggs test. I found out I'm a JERK or a PERV, right? But here's the deal. It would change everything if we just decided to say, hey, I'm going to take responsibility, even if I don't have to. I'm just going to own my life. So do what's helpful. Do what's responsible. And then number 3, do what honors God. Now, you might not consider yourself a religious person, right? And so it's like, I don't know Bible verses. I don't attend church services regularly. I don't even know what honors God. But I think you could answer the question intuitively. Right? Honoring God just means we live with the attitude of, it doesn't matter whether or not it's legal. I'm going to do the moral and ethical thing. So I was recently in Seattle, and I went with a friend to an Amazon Fresh grocery store. This is a store with cameras everywhere, and you don't have to talk to any cashiers or anything, and you just put things in your cart and then you walk out. And it's fascinating, this kind of technology. And as we were leaving, I said to him, have you ever left and found out later that you were not charged for something? And he laughed. He said, actually, the first time I went, because he said they don't even give you a receipt as you walk out. You get that emailed to you when you're home. So you don't even know how much you spent. He said, the first time I went, I realized I wasn't charged for an onion. And I thought that was the end of the story. And then he said, so I went through the work to contact them and let them know, I wasn't charged for this onion. And I couldn't believe it. I'm like, Larry, it's an onion, right? I consider myself a person of integrity, but come on, it's an onion. But he says, well, it wasn't mine. I didn't pay for it. And so he said, I made that right. And they even commented about his integrity. But here's the deal. You want to be a blessing to people, find ways to use your freedom and your resources and your connections and your opportunities in a way that blesses people and brings hope to them. Do you want to raise the bar? Then find ways to love your neighbor as yourself. In 1777, John Adams writes a letter to his wife, Abigail. And at the end of the letter, here's what he writes. He says, posterity. Okay, that means future generations. He says, you will never know how much it costs the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. It's following Jesus 101. You want to know how to live for Jesus in America today? How to follow him? Do what's helpful, do what's responsible, and do what honors God. And our life begins to make a difference. Could I pray for you? Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this great country. We thank you for the opportunity to live here. We thank you for the many, many freedoms we have. I pray that you would give us wisdom on how to be responsible with our freedoms, and that you would give us the courage to do what we know is right. In Jesus' name, amen.